It was a cold, cloudy day on a college campus. Students flooded the grounds, holding picket signs in one hand and fiercely signing with the other. Classes were canceled due to the blocked entrances of the campus and large crowds of protesters. The students and staff at Gallaudet University were outraged upon hearing the impactful decision that had been made, and they knew that something had to be done. Deaf President Now, Breaking Leadership Barriers at Gallaudet University. The 1988 Deaf President Now movement enabled the deaf community to govern their people by breaking leadership barriers at Gallaudet University. The 8th president of Gallaudet University, I. King Jordan, once said, "Deaf people can do anything hearing people can do except hear." Jordan and the Gallaudet students had the chance to prove this statement. After 124 years of hearing presidents, the students and staff at Gallaudet were determined to take down the barrier that had prevented them from having a deaf president for their deaf student body. Until the 19th century, education options for the deaf in the United States were limited. It wasn't until 1817 that the education barrier was broken, and the first permanent school for the deaf in the United States, the American School for the Deaf, was founded by Laurent Clerc and Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet. Edward Minor Gallaudet, one of Thomas Gallaudet's sons, worked with Amos Kendall, former United States postmaster, to establish the Columbia Institution for the Deaf and Dumb in 1857. Originally, the institution was an elementary and secondary school for deaf students. In 1864, the National Deaf-Mute College was formed, as the collegiate branch of the Columbia Institution. The college was renamed Gallaudet College in honor of Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet in 1894 and gained university status in 1986. With the 1987 resignation of Gallaudet's 6th president, Jerry C. Lee, various groups in the Gallaudet community started working toward a deaf president for the university. The official selection of the president was postponed for months, and eventually, 3 finalists were announced: Dr. Elizabeth Zinser, who was hearing and did not know sign language, as well as Dr. Harvey Corson and Dr. I. King Jordan, who were both deaf. In the week leading up to the board's vote, students and staff held rallies to gather support for a deaf president. Rally flyers included slogans like, "It's time." In 1988, the Gallaudet University presidency belongs to a deaf person. Additionally, the public became involved, with many people writing letters to Gallaudet protesters, the Board of Trustees, and even Congress throughout the movement. With so much support accumulating for a deaf president, it came as quite a shock when on March 6, 1988, the board majority voted to appoint Elizabeth Zinser, the only hearing candidate out of the 3 finalists, for university president. Zinser's appointment was scheduled to be announced at an open board meeting, but in reality was never formally disclosed to the public. As soon as the deaf community found out, however, they made their disapproval of both the board's announcement method and their selection known. Elizabeth Zinser, the only hearing candidate out of the 3 finalists, was unable to sign, which meant she was only able to communicate with the students through an American Sign Language interpreter. The hearing chairperson of Gallaudet's Board of Trustees at the time, Jane Spillman, was quoted through an interpreter in saying, "Deaf people are not ready to function in a hearing world." Though Spillman may have been misinterpreted, the deaf community still took this comment as extremely offensive. They argued that deaf people were ready to function in a hearing world, and that the 2 deaf candidates were just as qualified for the position as Zinser. The ensuing rallies escalated quickly, resulting in students leaving their classes and midterm exams. Protesting groups shut down the campus, and to prevent any unwanted authority from entering, the students hot-wired buses, parked them at every entrance of the school, and deflated their tires. People all over the world sent thousands of letters of both approval and disapproval. Even elementary school children sent letters to the university. With the beginning of the movement, deaf people everywhere were inspired to begin breaking down the barriers that had held them back for much of history. Student leaders included Brigitta Bornfurl, Gerald Covell, Greg Libach, and Tim Raris. Their goal was to change the mindset of the hearing world to one that accepted that, as Libach said, a deaf person could do anything. The students had 4 main demands. Elizabeth Zinser must resign, and a deaf president must be selected for the university. Jane Spillman must resign as chairperson of the board. The percentage of deaf board members on the Board of Trustees must increase to at least 51%. There must be no reprisals against any of the protesters. However, the board rejected these demands, and Zinser was still considered the 7th president of Gallaudet University. Throughout the following week, protests did not subside, and meetings were held between protesters and the board with no compromise reached. On March 10th, the 5th day of protests, Pat Johansson, a student leader, gave a speech based on Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous "I Have a Dream" speech. "I have a dream that one day Gallaudet University will send a clear message to all the world that yes, deaf people are fully capable of functioning in the hearing world," Johansson stated. This speech began to splinter the barriers in society that separated deaf people from their goals.
We are growing and growing, getting bigger and bigger. Since Monday, we've become stronger and stronger and stronger, and now we've become even stronger.
Zinser left her former job as president of the University of North Carolina and flew to Washington, D.C. on the 9th of March. After realizing the importance of the movement to the deaf community, she met with other administrative leaders and discussed the events of the past few days. Late that evening, Zinser resigned. The next day, when Zinser's resignation became official, supporters of the movement were overjoyed. However, they were not finished yet. The protesters still expected the university to meet the rest of their demands. Consequently, protests continued for 3 more days. Finally, on March 13, 1988, the 8th day of protests, the board met all 4 of the students' demands. On March 13th, the Board of Trustees held a meeting and decided that Jane Spillman was to resign as chairperson. A task force would be set up to achieve a deaf majority on the board. The university would not punish any protesters, and for the first time in 124 years of the university's existence, Gallaudet would have a deaf president. The board named I. King Jordan, one of the deaf candidates, the 8th president of Gallaudet University. The Deaf President Now protest was overwhelmingly successful in that the Board of Trustees met all 4 of the protesters' demands in such a short period of time. For centuries, the deaf community was kept behind a barrier of discrimination and misunderstanding in the hearing community. The Deaf President Now movement, however, was evidence that the deaf community has always been capable of standing up for its rights. Deaf President Now also altered the way hearing people saw deaf people and the way deaf people thought about themselves. Throughout the years after the movement, there have been numerous protests at residential schools for deaf students that mimic those of Deaf President Now. Additionally, though it has not been made a requirement that Gallaudet's president be deaf, all 4 presidents that have served since the movement have been deaf, showing the change that Deaf President Now made in the mindsets of people involved with the university. Deaf President Now has served as inspiration for thousands of people all over the world to not be afraid to break the barriers and overcome the challenges in their lives. Just as the women's rights and civil rights movements of the 20th century were founded on a culture standing up for itself, the Deaf President Now movement began with the desire for self-representation and ended with the triumph of success. This success has truly propelled society to realize that deaf people can do anything hearing people can do, except hear.